everybody. I'm going to have to remember to speak loudly because my microphone isn't working particularly well. We're looking at Stoner this week, and I apologize for all that bright light out there. We don't have curtains on our windows here, so I'm going to try to turn the screen a little bit so it's not completely drowning me out. And really, I just want to look at Chapter 1 of Stoner for this particular lesson. There's a good bit of historical background to the novel that is helpful to understand the time and the place that this novel is set. William goes to the university, as we're told in the very first paragraph. In fact, I'll just read it to you. William Stoner entered the University of Missouri as a freshman in the year 1910 at the age of 19. 8 years later, during the height of World War I, he received his Doctor of Philosophy degree and accepted an instructorship at the same university where he taught until his death in 1956. And of course, William Stoner is not a real person. He's the fictional character, the protagonist of this novel. But Williams treats it as if he is telling a biography. There's a great deal of historical overlap with real events in the world of that time period, 1910 to 1956, is essentially what we cover. There's a brief bit at the beginning of Chapter 1 where he discusses, Stoner's childhood and his, his time before he goes to the University of Missouri. And then from then on, it becomes a novel of the Academy, as I said in the introductory for this week. He almost never leaves again that university setting, the town where the university is, and he is not a world traveler by any stretch. He's not the sort of professor who goes to conferences all over the country. Not that they were as common then, obviously, because of travel and because of world events, World War I, World War II, the 1919 global pandemic, the Great Depression, other world events and national events interceded with what we would just take for granted these days in 2023, although until obviously COVID-19 came along, there was a lot more travel and a lot more conferences. It's part of the university life. It's part of the college life. As an instructor at North Country for the last 14 years, I've been to probably a couple dozen, mostly political events. By politics, I don't mean national politics or state politics, but rather an organization I was a part of called the Faculty Council of Community Colleges, and it was a representational body composed of faculty from the 34 community colleges throughout New York State, and we would get together twice annually for big meetings, and then we would have smaller committee meetings during the course of the year. And it's an important voice for university faculty. The SUNY four-year schools have a similar group called the FSU, the I can't remember, Faculty University Senate, and they do the same sort of advocacy, and those two groups interact. My point being that in 2020, when we shut down. The FCCC continued to meet via Zoom, as we did all our college meetings for a couple of years there, and we did most or all of our classes for a time through the medium of Zoom or Microsoft Teams or what have you. But that's a big part of the university life. That's a big part of the life of college professors and instructors, is to go to conferences. It's where you meet other people in your field. It's where you it's where you have um, symposiums on new ideas, discussions of all sorts of things, and uh, not to his credit, Stoner doesn't partake in any of that. Apparently, it's never reported to us that he goes anywhere. Of course, you learn by the end of the first few chapters that he becomes involved with first and then married to a woman who, at least, when they were dating, courting, as the term would have been in that time, it seemed a very loving relationship and very tender and so forth. And then as soon as they get married, everything having to do with sex terrifies his wife. They're only able to consummate their marriage, that is, have a successful sexual union a couple of times, and it's extremely painful for her. I think more emotionally, psychologically than it is physically. Although Williams doesn't delve into that, so I'm really just speculating here. But that seems to be the hesitation, and it may have something to do with her relationship with her father. Not that that was incestuous or anything like that, but just that she does not seem to have been well equipped for that part of marriage by any preparation from her parents. This was, a relatively frequent issue if you read a lot of literature from that time period, because people were so afraid of their bodies. They often reported, and it's often in novels of that time and other works of literature, that the act of love is not pleasant or pleasurable. It's they consider it sinful, or sort of like having a bowel movement. And so there's this sort of undercurrent, and Freud spoke to this throughout his career, Sigmund Freud. And a great number of his patients were people who had these sort of sexual hang-ups, and a lot of it had to do with the sort of what we call a zeitgeist, or the overall feeling that a culture takes on at a particular time about a particular thing, whatever it might happen to be. And in this case, with a great deal of religious prudity about sex and the body. People were covered from head to toe. They didn't expose much of their flesh in public. It was a very oddly asexual approach to life, and so when parents were confronted with sharing that with their children, quite often they failed miserably at that, or they wrapped it up in the idea that it's sinful somehow, or disgusting, or however you might want to characterize that. But they do at least have sex one time enough that they have their daughter, obviously, out of their union. And then the daughter, who initially seems to be very much much more connected to her father than to her mother, becomes essentially a football in their game of marital, almost battles. I don't know how else to characterize it. And her love for her father, her loyalty to him, if you will, begins to recede through the course of the novel. So it's yet another thing that William Stoner loses in the course of this long novel about losing things. But I'll backtrack now to chapter 1, and I really want to focus there, as I said, and give you some of the historical background that helps to make sense of the novel for you. The first thing is those first couple of paragraphs. It's an unusual approach to tell essentially the entire story before the story. You learn about the main events of William Stoner's life, all within the first two paragraphs of the novel. Kind of an interesting way to go about doing it. He's not the first writer to approach writing a novel this way, but the essence of those two paragraphs is that Stoner's life, when you boil it down, really doesn't add up to much, which is a very unusual thing for an author to tell you at the beginning of a book. But I'll just read the entire first two paragraphs and then have a few words to say on it. William Stoner entered the University of Missouri as a freshman in the year 1910 at the age of 19. 8 years later, during the height of the World War I, he received his Doctor of Philosophy degree and accepted an instructorship at the same university where he taught until his death in 1956. That's two sentences, and he's already dead. Kind of as I said, an interesting way to begin. He did not rise above the rank of assistant professor, and few students remembered him with any sharpness after they had taken his courses. When he died, his colleagues made a memorial contribution of a medieval manuscript to the university library. That's a book that nobody would read, for sure. This manuscript may still be found in the rare books collection, bearing the inscription, "Presented to the Library of the University of Missouri, in memory of William Stoner, Department of English," by his colleagues. An occasional student who comes upon the name may wonder idly who William Stoner was, but he seldom pursues his curiosity beyond a casual question. Stoner's colleagues, who held him in no particular esteem when he was alive, speak of him rarely now. To the older ones, his name is a reminder of the end that awaits them all, and to the younger ones, it is a sound, merely a sound, which evokes no sense of the past and no identity with which they can associate themselves or their careers. And then Williams backtracks to Stoner's boyhood, his growing up. It's very quick, growing up on this very humble farm in the middle of Missouri. So essentially, beginning, middle, and end of Stoner's life adds up to almost nothing. He's not remembered by his colleagues. He didn't write any great books. He jumped into the pond and left no ripple, essentially. And so why write a novel about it? It's a disarming sort of approach, and then the rest of the novel becomes an everyman story, and that's a long tradition in English writing. In fact, there's a play from the 13th or 14th century called Everyman, and those plays were not very cleverly written sometimes, and the characters were certainly not named anything very clear. They were written to instruct and performed to instruct people on how to live a proper Christian life. Everyman has a character in it named Everyman, and of course he's meant to represent not every man but every person. And then there's sin and temptation and death and characters that are really obviously named so that a small child could understand the allegory, that nobody's going to be confused by this. Most of the population at that time was illiterate, and so you need to keep, they thought, things simple so that a person who couldn't read would at least still get the point. They couldn't read the Bible, but they heard it read in Mass at church, and that provided them with the road to salvation, if you will. Well, William Stoner is an everyman in some ways. Not everybody becomes a university professor, of course, and not everybody gets a college education. Something like 64% of people in our country get some college, but that number drops significantly when you talk about numbers of people who complete college or complete a 4-year degree. It's a smaller number still who get a master's degree or a professional degree, such as becoming an attorney or a doctor. fewer numbers still who go on to get their PhDs. And to teach at the university level or at the college level, other than community colleges, it's essentially required that you have a PhD, that you have a doctorate in your area of expertise. Stoner achieves that, which is quite remarkable when you consider his background, that his parents are essentially illiterate. His father quit school, as we are told in the first chapter, at age 12, roughly 6th grade, to work on the family farm, and he never goes back. He never gets a high school diploma, and that was not uncommon, especially the more rural the setting back then, the less likely it was that a person would complete, beyond the 8th grade, which is where most public education stopped during the, mid 1800s, which is when Stoner's father would have been, of school age. So he's an everyman, but not an everyman. He never really fits in. We're told that. He's a little bit older than his other members of his graduating class because he graduated from high school, and then he had a year where he was just working on the farm. And then someone lets his father know that there's this agricultural school that had begun at the University of Missouri. It actually began in 1890, not the university, but the agricultural school. So it was about 20 years old by the time Stoner goes, well established by that point. And of course, these ag tech parts of universities were extremely important in helping to develop the agricultural breadbasket of the world, the American Midwest, with all the grain and other agricultural products, beef, pork, chicken, so forth, much of which comes from the heart of our country, that big Midwest. They were, by the time that these new agricultural practices had come into the fore, in the 1880s, 1890s, and early 20th century, they had stripped much of the value of the land by over-farming it. Many of these people, they were first-time farmers. They were, they may have known a little bit about agriculture, but they moved west in order to get the free land without much of an idea of how to farm. And so that planting the same crops year after year after year depletes the soil, and some crops, especially corn and wheat, tend to be heavy gobblers of nitrogen in the soil, which is essential for plants to be able to photosynthesize and to prosper. And if you go on long enough, as you all know, I'm sure, farming the same land without proper fertilization, you will just kill it. You will rob it of all of its. You'll still have dirt, but you won't have soil. You will have robbed it of its the necessary funguses and the necessary bacteria and the necessary minerals, enzymes, and so forth that are in soil. And then you've got nothing but dirt, which is essentially just ground down stone, and you aren't going to grow anything in that that requires any kind of minerals and so forth. There are plants, thankfully, that do survive in incredibly arid soil that is almost devoid of any nutrients. They pick up nutrients from the air. They pick up nutrients by attracting pollinators and birds and things like that, who supply a certain amount of guano or manure, and they're able to utilize that. Some plants are carnivorous, like the Venus flytrap, although it's a tropical plant. There are plants that lure essentially other animals, insects or birds or small mammals, and they become entrapped and become part of the food cycle of that plant. It's necessary for the plant to do that because it requires more nutrients than it's getting. Well, how does this apply to this story? We were told that Stoner's father's farm is very poor and getting poorer by the year, so he is sent off to the University of Missouri to be part of the ag program so that he can then come home and help to run the family farm more efficiently and in a more full way. His father undoubtedly got the farm either himself or through, a near ancestor, near, a parent or something like that, through the U.S. Homestead Act, which was in 1862, right in the height of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln and Congress, and then Abraham passed a law, or a bill, and then Lincoln signed it into law, that granted U.S. male citizens, white male citizens, I should say, up to 160 free acres of land, most of it west of the Mississippi. And it was a way to develop that area as part of the country. It was also a way to chase off Native Americans. It was a gift. The country had purchased the Louisiana Purchase, 1803, and had this huge untapped resource of farmland that had been prairie, had been the home of Native Americans and buffalo and so on and so forth. But it was one of the goals of the U.S. government to make that land into farmland or ranching land. All you had to do to get your 160 acres, and for some reason that's become 40 acres and a mule is the saying, but it was up to 160 acres, which is big. That's a lot of land. An acre is 400 by 400, 400 feet long by 400 feet wide. So you're talking about nearly a square mile of land. It's huge. Well, not a square mile, but a couple of acres is a square mile, and it's a lot of land. And the problem was there wasn't the infrastructure, there wasn't the wherewithal to make this work. There weren't readily available fertilizers and pesticides and things that were, really part of what people needed in order to get a farm to be arable and lively. The University of Missouri itself was established in 1839 through a state grant first of land and a lot of money to get. It was the first university west of the Mississippi. That's in slavery times, of course, and it developed these various colleges, including the College of Agriculture and so on, throughout the years. It actually admitted women fairly early on when you think about, comparing it to other places. It was a public university, and so there was a lot of more pressure on that than, say, a private university to accept women. And the first women were allowed in, I'm just peeking at my notes here, 1867, so right after the Civil War. They were only allowed to enter the education program, in other words, to become teachers. Teachers were greatly needed in a growing nation and with increasing populations. And so, women, especially young women, were part of that, economy. They were allowed then to become students with any degree program by 1872. So it's fairly early. Women didn't have the right to vote yet, of course. That was 1920. But women were beginning to be allowed to go to colleges and universities. We don't think of it that way anymore, that you were allowed to. It's a choice. But then it was, people were not permitted. Certain people were not permitted to go to the university. And just along those lines, the University of Missouri did not become racially integrated until 1950, when it allowed its first black students to be there. So what does this mean? It means a couple of things. It means that when Stoner is a student there from 1910 to 1918, and then as he is a professor there until his death in 1956, only 6 of those years would have been integrated years at the very end of his career. There's nothing about race, and integration in this novel in that sense. But it also means that he would have had fellow female students who were female in his classes. It was a co-ed campus. There weren't co-ed dorms, but there were it was a co-ed campus, and women would have been in his classes, and women would have been his students as well. So there's that little bit. I went to a private college that didn't admit women students until just 4 or 5 years before I went there. In 1977, I think, was the year that Hamilton College admitted its first women classes, and it actually did it by merging with a women's college that had been established across the road, Kirkland College, and Kirkland was not making a lot of money. Hamilton was, and so they essentially merged together, and just the Kirkland students became Hamilton students, and you took classes on both sides of the road, and ate in whatever cafeteria you wanted to. By the time I got there, most of the furor of that had settled down. There was still a little bit of it, but it was pretty much a thing of the past. What else in the first chapter? Just as background, and then I'll develop more in the next of these little lectures. I'm going to quit at the 30-minute mark, so I'm just keeping my eye on the clock as well. Stoner goes to college he had never even thought about it. I mean, it's just not part of his daily life, was thinking about, school much. He was a decent student, not a great student, but it had never occurred to him the idea of going to college when he was growing up. And so when it's presented to him, he's a little bit flummoxed, and he's kind of hoping his parents will talk him out of it. But his father, who has more to say than his mother on most things, is reticently encouraging. He sees the value in an education as long as it's practical. Later in chapter 1, of course, when Stoner announces to his parents that he's not going to return to the farm, at first they misunderstand and think he's just got some courses he needs to finish up or something like that. And then his father embarrassedly asks him, are you in some kind of trouble? Which, of course, euphemistically means, did you get a girl pregnant? And Stoner is rather shocked that his father would even ask him that. But his parents are lovely. They really are. They're broken down by their lives of hard work and toil and worry. The farm is not prospering. It's getting worse every year. It's dirt poor. There's that poignant moment when his father says, I can send you $2 or $3 a month, which, doesn't sound like much at all, but it would have been like sending somebody $20 a month these days, which still wasn't much. But it's a mark of his father's generosity and love. You never really see Stoner and his parents exchanging any, words of love to each other. Everything is very emotionally withheld in this novel. Something I'll pick up on the next of these little lecturettes. But they let him go, which is surprising in some ways. But the father realizes that the farm is going to go under if he doesn't change things. And then Stoner, in that miraculous scene, and that's where I'm going to pick it up next time, where he fails to explain a Shakespeare sonnet, but he gets the bug. He gets the education bug, something that I have, something that many people in my position have. We love school, we love learning, and something pulls us in a direction. We're very interested, in something, and then something grabs us and drags us in a different direction, and that's what happens to Stoner. And he essentially just leaves the ag program completely and begins taking as many English courses as he can cram into a semester and ends up being a university professor. And with that, I will leave it for now, and I will post another probably about this time tomorrow, maybe a little bit later in the week. We'll see. Mondays and Wednesdays are good for me for doing this kind of thing. Tuesdays, Thursdays, not so much. But I will venture to get something either Tuesday or Wednesday of this week. And for until then, have a pleasant week.